The question left her lips before she could stop it, and the silence that followed was so absolute that Effie Carver could hear her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs like a fist against a locked door. "Have you ever loved anyone?" She had not planned to ask it. She had not planned any of this, not standing in the middle of a stranger's parlor in Redemption, Texas, with dust still on her boots and grief still raw in her chest, not facing a man whose reputation alone had made the stagecoach driver cross himself when she spoke the name Frederick Stone. She had planned only to survive. But survival, she was learning, had a way of leading a person directly into the moments they least expected. Frederick Stone did not flinch. He did not look away. He did not offer the hollow deflection she had watched other men use when the truth was inconvenient. He simply turned those storm-gray eyes fully upon her, eyes that had seen things she could not imagine, that carried the weight of a dark past the way stone carries the memory of rain, and he nodded. Once. Slow. Deliberate. And that single nod cracked something open inside Effie Carver that she had spent 6 months welding shut. She had come to Redemption chasing a secret. She had come because her brother was dead, and the man responsible was alive and breathing the same dusty Texas air as everyone else in this territory. Wearing a badge on his chest like righteousness was something you could pin on with 2 fingers. She had come because every judge she had spoken to in San Antonio had looked through her like she was made of glass, and every lawman she had petitioned had smiled the patient smile of men who had already made their arrangements with the devil. She had come because someone, a former soldier turned whiskey salesman in a Fort Worth saloon, had leaned across a sticky bar top and said, quiet as a confession, "If you need something done that the law won't touch, there is a man in Redemption who still has a conscience. His name is Frederick Stone, and he will either help you or he will not, but he will not lie to you about which one it is going to be." She had arrived expecting a monster. She had arrived prepared for a mercenary, a killer, a man shaped entirely by violence and self-interest, a hired gun whose only god was the fee at the end of a job. She had arrived with her jaw set, and her heart armored and her request rehearsed to the point of flatness. She had not arrived prepared for a man who looked at her when she asked if he had ever loved anyone and simply nodded, as if the answer was both the simplest and the heaviest thing in the world, and as if he saw no reason to lie about the weight of it. She had not arrived prepared for the way that nod would reach inside her chest and rearrange things she thought were permanent. But here she was. And here he was. And the story that had carried them both to this moment was long and tangled and full of the kind of pain that does not announce itself cleanly. The kind that ambushes you in quiet moments, in the space between sleep and waking, in the pause before you ask a question you had no business asking a gunslinger in his own parlor in 1882. It had begun, as so many catastrophes do, on an ordinary morning. Effie had been 26 years old and living in the small but dignified arrangement she and her brother Thomas had cobbled together in San Antonio. Thomas was 23. Built like their father but with their mother's quick laugh and their mother's tendency to trust the wrong people, which was charming in a woman who kept mostly to domestic circles, and was fatal in a young man who had somehow gotten himself tangled up with a land speculator named Harlan Creed. Harlan Creed was not a lawman in 1882, though he had been sheriff of Redemption County for 3 years prior, and had used those 3 years to accumulate the kind of power that does not vanish when the badge does. He was 51 years old, thick-necked, prosperous, and dangerous in the particular way of men who have never once been held accountable for anything they have done. He had connections to the county commissioner, to the territorial land office, to the railroad men who were quietly buying up property across the Texas Hill Country like a tide that did not care what it swallowed. Thomas Carver, with his quick mind and his unfortunate tendency toward moral indignation, had discovered something he was not meant to discover. He had been working as a clerk for a San Antonio solicitor, a decent man named Mr. Aldrich, who handled property disputes, and in the process of organizing files one Thursday afternoon in October of 1881, Thomas had come across documentation that made his blood run cold. Forged land grants, falsified surveys, a trail of stolen acreage that had dispossessed at least 4 ranching families and 2 farming families, their land scooped cleanly into the holdings of a company registered in a name Effie had never heard of, but which Thomas, who had done his research, traced directly to Harlan Creed. Thomas had come home that Thursday evening with the kind of energy Effie associated with disaster, too bright in the eyes, too fast in the speech, too certain that the world would behave the way it was supposed to if you simply presented it with the correct evidence. "Effie," he had said, setting a leather satchel on the kitchen table with the reverence of a man depositing a holy relic, "I have found something important." She had told him to be careful. He had told her not to worry. By March of 1882, Thomas Carver was dead. The official verdict was an accident. He had apparently lost control of his horse on the road north of the city and been thrown, and the injuries sustained had been inconsistent with survival. The county coroner, who Effie subsequently discovered owed Harlan Creed a considerable sum of money, had signed the paperwork without hesitation. Effie had stood at her brother's grave in the hard March light and felt the grief and the fury arrive simultaneously, 2 forces that did not cancel each other out but instead fused into something cold and purposeful. She was not a woman who wept loudly. She was a woman who planned. But planning required resources she did not have and allies she could not find, and after 3 months of methodical, dignified, utterly futile appeals to the legal and governmental structures of San Antonio and the surrounding territories, she had found herself in a Fort Worth saloon at 2 in the afternoon listening to a former soldier describe a gunslinger in Redemption, Texas. She had taken the stagecoach the following week. Redemption was not what the name suggested. It was a town of approximately 400 people, organized around a single main street that had the self-important width of a city boulevard but the ramshackle architecture of frontier pragmatism, a general store, a hotel of dubious comfort, 2 saloons, a livery, a small church that appeared to double as a schoolhouse, and a scattering of other establishments that testified to the basic human need for food, drink, shelter, and the occasional haircut. The dust was the color of old bone. The sun was remorseless. The people who moved through the main street did so with the particular efficiency of those who had made peace with hardship. Effie had climbed down from the stagecoach with her small traveling trunk, her leather satchel containing Thomas's documents. She had kept every copy he had made, had found his notes hidden in the false bottom of the satchel itself, had spent weeks deciphering his careful handwriting, and the address of a boarding house recommended by the whiskey salesman in Fort Worth. She had arranged herself at the boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Delamarche, who asked few questions and provided excellent coffee, and then she had spent 2 days asking careful, indirect questions about Frederick Stone before she felt she had enough of a picture to approach him. What she had gathered was this. Frederick Stone was 32 years old and had come to Redemption 4 years prior. He had a reputation as a man who had once worked as a hired gun, not the lawless variety, or so the consensus went, but the kind who had operated somewhere in the gray territory between law enforcement and private justice during the cattle war years in Wyoming, and then again during the disputed land conflicts along the New Mexico border. He had killed men. That was not in dispute. What was disputed, and what gave Redemption's opinion of him a quality of genuine uncertainty rather than simple condemnation, was whether the men he had killed had deserved it. He lived in a solid adobe house at the eastern edge of town. He had a garden of some kind. Mrs. Marsh had mentioned this with the faint surprise of a woman who found it an unexpected detail. He was known to be quiet, honest to the point of occasional bluntness, and possessed of a dark past that he neither advertised nor concealed but simply carried. He had not, as far as anyone in Redemption could determine, killed anyone in over 2 years. He did not currently have a job. Several people hinted, with varying degrees of delicacy, that he was trying to be something other than what he had been, and that this endeavor was proceeding with mixed success. He did not drink to excess. He read books, which Mrs. Marsh reported with the tone of someone describing a minor eccentricity. He attended church approximately once a month, which the minister seemed to regard as better than nothing. He was, in the summary of a rancher's wife who had known him since his arrival, and seemed to harbor a certain protective affection for him, the most complicated simple man you will ever meet. Effie had taken all of this information, weighed it against her need and her limited options, and gone to knock on the door of the adobe house on a Wednesday morning in late June of 1882. He had answered the door himself. She had not known what she expected, something harder perhaps, something more overtly dangerous, the visual shorthand of villainy or at least of ferocity. What she found was a tall man with broad shoulders and dark hair beginning to show the first threads of gray at the temples, wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, who looked at her with gray eyes that were neither warm nor cold but simply entirely, uncomfortably attentive. "Mr. Stone," she had said, her voice steady because she had practiced steadiness until it was automatic. "My name is Effie Carver. I have come from San Antonio on a matter of significant urgency, and I was told you might be willing to hear me out. I would appreciate 15 minutes of your time." He had looked at her for a moment, not the way men often looked at her, not the assessing, proprietorial survey she had learned to deflect, but with a directness that felt more like listening than looking, as though he were already paying attention before she had finished speaking. "Come in," he had said. The inside of the house was spare and clean. There was a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books that she noted instinctively, a Bible, a volume of Tennyson, several legal texts, what appeared to be a medical manual, and a battered edition of something by Marcus Aurelius. There was a cast-iron stove. There was a window facing east. The garden she had heard about was visible through it, herbs, she thought, and what looked like tomatoes. There were no decorations except for a single framed photograph on the shelf beside the books, positioned with the photograph facing away from the room. She noticed that too. She filed it away. He had set coffee on the table, real coffee, strong and good, and sat across from her and said, "Take whatever time you need." She had laid Thomas's documents on the table between them, and she had talked for 40 minutes, not 15, and he had not interrupted her once. He had looked at the documents when she indicated them. He had asked 2 questions, both precise. One about the specific registration details of the company she believed fronted Creed's holdings, and one about the coroner's name. When she finished, the coffee was cold and the sun had shifted, and Frederick Stone was looking at the documents with an expression she could not read. "You understand," she said carefully, because she needed to be certain there was no misunderstanding about what she was and was not asking, "that I am not asking you to kill him." He had looked up at that. Something that might have been humor moved briefly through his gray eyes and was gone. "Good," he said, "because I don't do that anymore." "I am asking for help building a case that cannot be dismissed," she said. "I have the documents, but I need corroboration. I need witnesses who are still alive and willing to speak. I need someone who knows this territory and knows where the buried things are buried. And I need someone who cannot be bought because everyone I have gone to has already been bought." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me about your brother." She had not expected that. She had expected either a negotiation about payment, she had money, not much but some, or a refusal. She had not expected him to ask about Thomas. The question caught her so cleanly off guard that the grief surged up before she could stop it, and for a moment her composure did something it had not done in 6 months of determined maintenance. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went bright. She breathed. "He was kind," she said, when she had control of her voice again. "He was smart and he was good, and he thought that the truth was enough. He thought that if you showed people the truth, they had to respond to it. He had not yet learned that some people respond to truth by eliminating the person who holds it. Frederick Stone looked at her across the table and something shifted in his face. Not pity, she would have resented pity. Something quieter, something that recognized pain from a familiarity with it. "How long had you two been on your own?" he asked. "Since I was 19 and he was 16, she said. "Our parents died of fever within the same winter. We had a small inheritance and I had some skill with bookkeeping and Thomas had his intelligence and we managed." 7 years, he said. 7 years, she confirmed. And then before she could think about it, she said, "We looked out for each other. That is all. We were careful and we looked out for each other, and then he found those documents and I did not look out for him carefully enough." The guilt in her voice was not something she had meant to let out. It had been living behind all the other things, behind the anger, behind the focus, behind the grinding practicality of the pursuit. And it came out now in those words with a rawness that embarrassed her immediately. But Frederick Stone did not look embarrassed on her behalf. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said, "It was not your failure. He made his own choices." "He was 23, she said. "That is old enough for your own choices," he said, and it was not a dismissal but an offering, the suggestion that Thomas's death had been caused by Thomas's courage and Harlan Creed's evil, and that she did not have to carry it as her own deficiency. It was, she realized, a very specific thing to understand. Not everyone understood it. She looked at him for a moment. "Will you help me?" she asked. He picked up one of the documents, the one with the forged surveyor's signature, and studied it. Then he set it down. Then he said, "I need 2 days to look into something. Come back Friday morning." She had gone back to Mrs. Marsh's boarding house and had spent Thursday in a state of disciplined waiting, which was not her natural mode but which she had practiced extensively over the preceding months. She wrote letters. She organized Thomas's notes into a more coherent form. She had dinner with Mrs. Marsh and a taciturn rancher named Amos Webb, who appeared to be a regular boarder, and spoke exclusively about cattle with the passion of a man for whom cattle had become a spiritual calling. Friday morning, she went back to the adobe house on the eastern edge of town. Frederick Stone opened the door and said, "He forged 3 deeds in this county. 2 of the original landowners are still alive and living within a day's ride. The 3rd family moved to Colorado after they were displaced. The county surveyor who falsified the surveys retired 18 months ago to a ranch outside of Comfort. He has been, according to my information, drinking heavily and telling people he has made mistakes he regrets. He may be willing to talk." Effie stared at him. "You found all of that in 2 days." "I know people in this county," he said simply. "I also know a judge in Austin who owes his reputation to the truth getting out about a different kind of land fraud 3 years ago. He is not bought. He will hear a case if the case is properly built." She stood in his doorway with the morning sun at her back and felt, for the first time in 6 months, something that was not grief and not fury. It was the distant, fragile sensation of a door opening in a house she had thought was entirely sealed. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it with her whole body, all the way down to the bone. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "It's going to take time and it's going to be complicated, and Creed has friends in this county who will not appreciate being investigated. There is a degree of danger in this." "I am aware of danger," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, "Come in. I have coffee and we need to plan." That had been the beginning. And over the days that followed, riding out to speak with the displaced landowners, spending evenings at his table with documents spread between them and coffee going cold, exchanging careful words about the logistics of justice and the intricacies of land law. Something else had been growing alongside the investigation, something neither of them was acknowledging because neither of them had the architecture for it yet. She noticed things about him in the way you notice things about a person when you are in close proximity over sustained time and paying genuine attention. She noticed that he moved with the economy of a person who had once had to be precise about physical space, but that within his own house he was surprisingly at ease, touching things lightly, books, the edge of the table, the handle of a coffee pot with a kind of unconscious tenderness. She noticed that he never rushed her when she was thinking, never filled silences with noise for the sake of it. She noticed that he read in the evenings with a lamp pulled close, and a small concentrated frown that made him look younger than his years and more approachable than his reputation. She noticed that the framed photograph on the shelf was always facing away, and she did not ask about it, but she thought about it. She noticed that when she made him laugh, which happened twice in the first week, both times when she said something wry about the absurdity of frontier legal bureaucracy, the sound of it was startled, as though he had not expected to laugh and was not entirely sure how to accommodate the feeling. He noticed things about her too, though he was more discreet about it. But she caught his attention on her face sometimes when she was reading, when she was frustrated, when she was exhausted, and the grief was showing again. Caught it the way you catch something moving at the edge of your vision just for a moment, and then it was gone, arranged back into the neutral expression he maintained with the discipline of long habit. They went to visit the first of the displaced landowners on the third day, a man named Solomon Riker, who had ranched 40 acres south of Redemption, before Creed's company had contested his title with forged documents in 1879, and won on the basis of a corrupt judge who had since retired to Mexico. Solomon Riker was now renting a small place from a neighbor, working as hired help on land he had once owned outright, and he had the particular bitterness of a man who had been robbed with the full complicity of the law. He looked at Frederick Stone with the wariness of a man who remembered who Stone used to be and was not entirely sure what he was now. Frederick Stone said, "I am trying to help this woman get justice for her brother and for the people Creed stole from. I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to look at what she has and tell me if it matches your experience." Solomon Riker had looked at Thomas's documents for a long time. Then he had looked at Effie, and he said, "The surveyor's name on that forged document, Beaumont. He came to my property in April of '79 and spent a day out on the southern boundary. When the contested deed came through, his survey said my southern boundary was 200 yards further north than I knew it to be, changed the acreage by 30%. Would you be willing to say that to a judge?" Effie asked. Solomon Riker had looked at the table. "I have a wife," he said, "and 2 children." "I understand," Effie said. "I am not asking you to decide today." On the road back in the long golden light of a Texas afternoon, she and Frederick Stone rode side by side with the comfortable silence of people who had found a rhythm with each other. After a while she said, "He will not testify." "He might," Frederick Stone said. "He needs to know the risk is worth it. Right now it looks like one woman and a pile of old papers. We need to build it bigger before we come back to him." "You think like a strategist," she said. "I spent years doing work that required it," he said, and then, after a pause, "not always for good reasons." It was the first time he had gestured at the dark past the whole town seemed to know about in outline but nobody discussed in his presence. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead. "Will you tell me about it?" she asked. A pause. The horses moved through the dry grass. "Eventually," he said, "when it matters to what we're doing." She understood that to mean he would tell her when he trusted her enough, and she understood further that this was a reasonable position for a man who had learned to be careful. She did not push. They returned to Redemption as the sun was setting, and the town was going through its evening transformation. The work sounds quieting, the saloon sounds rising, the smoke from supper fires rising in thin columns into the cooling air. He walked her to Mrs. Marsh's boarding house and said good night at the gate, and she watched him walk back toward the eastern side of town and thought, against her better judgment, that he moved like a man carrying a great weight in a way he had learned to make look natural. She went inside and stood for a moment in the narrow hallway, her hand on the wall, and thought, "Be careful, Effie Carver. You are here for one reason and it is not this." She was correct. She was also already losing the argument with herself. The retired surveyor's name was Arthur Beaumont, and he was living on a small property outside the town of Comfort, which was a 2-day ride from Redemption. Frederick had proposed making the journey, and Effie had agreed without hesitation, and the look he gave her at this, the faint surprise at her readiness, had told her that he had perhaps expected her to remain behind while he handled the more mobile elements of the investigation. "I am coming," she said. "Thomas was my brother." He had nodded as if this settled things completely, which it did. They left before dawn on a Monday morning, riding out with the stars still thick above the Texas hills. Mrs. Marsh had packed food. The horses, a solid bay gelding from the livery for Effie, and Frederick's own black horse, a large, serious animal named Bishop who seemed to have his owner's habit of watchful economy, moved easily in the cool morning air. The ride itself was long and occasionally difficult and more beautiful than Effie had expected, because the Texas hill country in late June had a complicated loveliness. The cedar and oak throwing their shadows, the limestone outcroppings white in the sunlight, the distant sound of water where the rivers ran shallow and clear between their banks. She was a good rider, competent and comfortable, and Frederick Stone noticed this with the same quiet attention he brought to most things. They stopped for a midday meal beside a creek, sitting in the shade on opposite banks of a shallow crossing, and he said abruptly, "In Wyoming in '76 I was hired by a cattle company to protect their interests in a range dispute. The men who hired me were not, I later learned, the legitimate owners of the range they were defending. They were themselves the usurpers. I had not done sufficient investigation before I took the work." Effie looked at him across the creek. He was looking at the water. "People were hurt," he said, "on both sides, including some who should not have been involved at all. I left when I understood what I was part of." But leaving did not undo what had already happened. He paused. "That is the short version." "And the longer version?" she asked because she wanted it. He looked up at her. The gray eyes were careful and direct at the same time, which was an expression she had come to associate with him specifically, the combination of caution and honesty, as if he was choosing carefully what to offer but was not willing to offer anything false. "The longer version involves a woman who believed I knew what I was doing when I took that work, and who was right to stop believing it," he said. "She had a younger brother as well. He died in the dispute. I do not know if it was directly my actions or someone else's in the group I was working with. I cannot be certain. What I am certain of is that I was there and that I should have known better, and that by the time I knew better it was too late to undo any of it." The silence between them had weight. Not uncomfortable weight, the weight of truth shared carefully. "That is why you left," she said, "and why you came to redemption." "I came to redemption because it was far enough away that I could try to be someone different," he said. "Whether that is possible remains to be established." She thought about what to say. She thought about what it meant to carry that kind of knowledge about yourself, not the knowledge of external accusation, which could be argued against or denied, but the internal knowledge that you had been part of something wrong and had not known fast enough to stop it, and that people had died in the gap between your understanding and your action. "You are different," she said. "You are sitting here helping me build a case against a man who is exactly the kind of man you were working for before. That is not nothing." He looked at her with something that she recognized with a little shock as vulnerability, not the open, displayed kind, but the brief, unguarded kind, the kind that happens when someone says exactly the right thing and the armor shifts, just for a moment without meaning to. "No," he said quietly, "it is not nothing." They rode on after that, and the conversation moved into easier territory. She told him about her years in San Antonio, about the bookkeeping work that had kept her and Thomas afloat, about the city itself, about the particular texture of life in a place that was simultaneously trying to be a modern city and still very much a frontier town. He listened with the focused quality she had come to recognize as characteristic. Not politely, the way people listen when they are waiting for their turn to speak, but actually, as if the information mattered to him. He told her about redemption, about why he had stayed, about the people there he had come to know, about the garden which had started as a practical measure and had become, he admitted with a kind of self-deprecating honesty, something he found genuinely satisfying. "There is a logic to growing things," he said. "You put in the work and the thing either grows or it does not, and if it does not you can usually identify what went wrong. It is more reliable than most human endeavors." She laughed, and he heard it, and she saw the slight change in his face that happened when she laughed, something that relaxed, something that attended. They camped that night under the open sky, a proper camp with a fire and bedrolls positioned respectably apart, and he took the first watch and she slept better than she had in months, which she chose not to think about too carefully. Arthur Beaumont was not what she had imagined. He was 60 years old and had the look of a man who had been prosperous and was now diminished not entirely in material terms, though his small property showed the wear of reduced circumstances, but in the way he held himself. There was a slumping quality to his posture that spoke of something internal. He answered the door on a Tuesday morning looking at them with eyes that held recognition, and beneath it, a kind of desperate expectancy, as though he had been waiting for exactly this visit and was not entirely sure whether its arrival was a relief or a final reckoning. "Mr. Beaumont," Frederick Stone said, "I think you know why we are here." Beaumont looked at Effie, then at Stone, then at the documents Effie held. "Come in," he said, with the voice of a man who has been carrying something too heavy and has finally reached the place where he can set it down. Inside his small house, neat, comfortable, the evidence of a careful domestic life maintained by habit even as the spirit behind it had become uncertain, he poured them water from a pitcher and sat at his kitchen table and told them everything. Not the short version, the long version. Every falsified survey, every coerced signature, every private arrangement with Harlan Creed that had begun with payment and continued through a combination of ongoing payment and the unspoken threat of what would happen to a man who was no longer useful to someone like Creed. He named dates. He named amounts. He described specifically the surveys he had falsified and how, and why his falsification would be detectable by any competent surveyor who went back to the land with proper instruments and the original federal surveys as reference. "Why did you do it?" Effie asked when he had finished. She was not asking to condemn him. She genuinely needed to understand the mechanics of how a person chose this. Beaumont looked at his hands. "The first time I needed the money," he said. "My wife was ill and the medical bills were beyond what I could pay. Creed offered me enough to cover it and I told myself it was one time. That is always what you tell yourself." He paused. She recovered, and by that time I was already in too deep for one time to be the whole of it. "And now," Frederick Stone said, "your wife." "She died," Beaumont said, 18 months ago, of something else entirely, something nothing could have helped." He paused. "After she died, I thought about what I had done. I thought about the families. The Riker family, the others. I thought about a young man named Thomas Carver who came to see me 6 months before he died." Effie went very still. "He came to see you," she said. Beaumont looked at her with great sadness. "He had traced some of the documentation further than I expected anyone to trace it. He came to ask me if I would be willing to talk. I said no. I told him I did not know what he was talking about." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I heard he died 3 months later." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Effie sat with her hands flat on the table and her grief and fury moving through her like weather, controlled because control was what she had, because collapsing in front of a man whose testimony she needed would not serve Thomas. "He came to you," she said very quietly, "and you turned him away and 3 months later he was dead." "Yes," Beaumont said. He did not minimize it. He did not offer excuses. He simply accepted the weight of it with the posture of a man who had been accepting it alone for a long time and was now accepting it in company, which was somehow worse and also somewhat more bearable. "I have thought about whether, if I had talked to him, it would have changed anything. I do not know. Creed would have known immediately. It might have ended the same way." He looked at Effie directly. "But it might not have, and I chose not to find out." Frederick Stone said quietly, "Mr. Beaumont, will you testify?" A long pause. The clock on the mantel ticked. Through the window, a bird moved in the heat. "Yes," Arthur Beaumont said. "I will testify. I have made my peace with my wife's memory as best I could, and I cannot make any better peace than this." On the road back to Redemption 2 days, the same limestone hills, the same wide sky, the same horses moving through the long grass. Effie did not speak much on the first day. She was thinking about Thomas going to Beaumont's house alone, certain that the truth was enough, and being turned away, and riding home without knowing that the meeting had just sealed his fate, because the moment he walked out of that door, Beaumont had probably certainly warned Creed that someone was getting close. Frederick rode beside her and did not fill the silence with noise, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on. He let her think. He let her grieve. Toward evening, when they stopped to water the horses at a stream, and she was standing at the edge of the water looking at her own reflection in the still section near the bank, he came to stand beside her. He was brave, Frederick said, doing what he was doing alone with only documents and logic to protect him. He was brave and he was young and he ran out of time. That is the truth of it. "I know," she said. "I know all of that. It does not make it less." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She turned to look at him and said, without planning it, "Have you lost someone, not in the Wyoming way, someone you loved?" He was quiet for a moment. The horses drank. The stream moved. "Yes," he said. She waited, but he did not elaborate immediately. She understood that this was connected to what he had told her at the other stream, the story about Wyoming and the woman whose brother had died, and she understood that there were layers to it that he was not ready to unfold all at once, and she respected that. "I am sorry," she said. It was the same thing he had not said to her but had communicated without words, and she meant it in the same way, not as a formality, but as a genuine acknowledgement of the fact that loss was loss, and it mattered regardless of the circumstances. He looked at her and nodded. Just once, with that particular quality of his that made even the simplest gesture feel entirely deliberate. They rode back to Redemption, and the investigation continued, and the days became weeks, and the shape of things in that period of sustained, purposeful effort had a quality that Effie would think about long afterward with a kind of wondering tenderness. They built the case piece by piece. They went back to Solomon Riker with Beaumont's written preliminary statement, prepared by Frederick, who had enough legal knowledge from his years of working in its gray territories to know what a judge would need. And Solomon Riker read it and read it again and looked at his wife, who was standing in the doorway of their rented house, and she gave a small, careful nod that seemed to carry within it the weight of a longer private conversation, and Solomon Riker said, "All right, I will testify." They found the second displaced family, a woman named Clara Hinds, who had been farming with her husband before he died of influenza in 1880, leaving her alone with the contested land claim, which Creed's company had then pursued with particular eagerness. Clara Hinds had moved to a cousin's property outside Kerrville and had been fighting a separate legal battle with what little she had. She was in her 40s, formidable, burning with a quiet, controlled rage that Effie recognized immediately as the same fuel that had kept her own engine running for 6 months. Clara Hinds read every document, asked 12 specific questions, accepted a cup of her own coffee back from Frederick Stone when he poured it without remarking on the peculiarity of a guest serving the host, because she could see he was doing it to give her something to hold while she thought. Then she said, "I have been waiting for someone to come. I had given up waiting. I will do whatever you need." 3 families, 1 surveyor, Thomas's original documentation. Frederick's contacts in the county carefully, quietly reached, the kind of information gathering that required both patience and the particular knowledge of where the reliable people were in a system riddled with unreliable ones. And the judge in Austin, a man named Elias Forsyth, with whom Frederick wrote a careful, detailed letter that Effie read and revised twice before they sent it, and who wrote back within 2 weeks with a response that made Effie's hands shake. Judge Forsyth wrote that he had himself received reports of Creed's activities through other channels, and had been unable to act on them for lack of sufficient corroborated evidence. He wrote that what Frederick Stone's letter described, if accurate and fully documented, was more than sufficient basis for a formal inquiry with subpoena power. He wrote that he would come to Redemption in September to take depositions. It was August when they received this letter. Effie read it sitting at Frederick's table and looked up at him with tears she refused to let fall, because she had not let herself cry since the funeral, and she was not going to start in the middle of a working afternoon. Frederick Stone looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Then, Thomas would be relieved. The tears came anyway. She turned her face, and he did not make a production of it, and after a moment she had control of herself again, and looked back at him with eyes that were probably betraying more than she intended. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the careful neutrality, not the quiet attention, not the briefly unguarded vulnerability. Something else. Something that was making its way up through the layers of restraint and dark past and careful rebuilding, like a plant coming through stone. Something that was very clear and very certain and extremely frightened of itself. She looked at him and felt the same thing looking back at her from the inside. They had dinner that evening. Not a planned dinner. She had not intended to stay, but he had started making food while she was still organizing documents, and had simply set a plate in front of her without asking, and it had seemed entirely natural to eat at his table in the lamplit evening, with the window open to the summer night, and the sound of Redemption going quietly about its business outside. He made cornbread and beans with salt pork, and it was very good, and she told him so, which surprised him in the particular way that praise always surprised people who were not accustomed to receiving it. "You are a better cook than you had to be," she said. "I had to be better eventually," he said. "Eating badly is a choice when you are in one place long enough," she smiled. He saw it, and the thing she had seen in his face earlier moved again, warmer. "Effie," he said, just her name, but with a tone that asked a question. She looked at him across the table and the lamplight and the scattered documents and the remnants of dinner and thought, here it is. Here is the moment. She thought, you came here for Thomas, and you are leaving in September when the judge has taken depositions, and the case is built, and Creed is confronted by the full weight of what he has done. She thought, you do not know what happens after that, and this man has a dark past and a garden and a habit of looking at you as if you are the most interesting thing he has ever tried to read, and you are already in over your head. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a long moment, and the quality of his quietness had changed. It was not the comfortable listening silence, but the silence of a man choosing between speaking and not speaking, weighing the cost of each. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And I want to be clear that I am not telling it to ask anything of you, or to complicate what we are doing, or to make the remaining work more difficult. I am telling it because you asked me a question at the creek and I gave you a partial answer, and I think you deserve the fuller one." She waited. "The woman in Wyoming," he said. "Her name was Mary. She was the sister of the man who died. I did not know her well before. I had seen her twice, briefly, but after her brother died and I understood what I had been part of, I went to her. Not to explain myself or to seek forgiveness, because I knew I was not owed either of those things. I went because I thought she should know the truth of what had happened, even if knowing it came from the person who should have prevented it." He looked at the table. "She received me. She heard me out. She did not forgive me, and I did not ask her to. But over the months that followed, as I was trying to determine what to do next and where to go, we wrote letters, and the letters became something other than I expected them to become." He stopped. "Then she died, in the spring of '79. Fever, very fast, the way fever takes people when it decides to. We had not had enough time. What we had was enough for me to know what it was, and not enough for it to become what it might have become. And after that I came to Redemption." Effie looked at the photograph on the shelf, face turned away. "That is Mary," she said, not a question. "Yes," he said. "You turned it away because," she said, and then stopped, because she knew why. because having it face the room meant having it face whatever else was happening in the room, and whatever else was now happening in the room was something he had not expected to happen and was not sure he had the right to let happen. "Frederick," she said. He looked up at her. "I have been trying," she said, carefully and honestly, "not to notice certain things, since approximately the second week. I have been very disciplined about it and largely successful, except for the parts where I have been completely unsuccessful." Something happened in his face. The armor shifted, not a crack, not a breach, but a voluntary opening. The difference between a wall coming down and a door being opened, which is the difference between destruction and choice. "Effie," he said, "I am 32 years old and I have made a series of decisions over the preceding decade that I am still in the process of accounting for. I have been trying to be something different from what I was, and I do not yet know whether I have succeeded. I am uncertain whether I am in a position to. I am not asking you to be certain," she said. "I am only telling you what is true. You can do with that what you think is right." The evening air moved through the open window. The lamp flickered. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and the contact was so careful, so deliberate, so entirely different from any carelessly possessive gesture she had experienced that her throat tightened. "I think," he said very quietly, "that what is true on my end is the same." She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a long moment in the lamplight, with the documents of Thomas's justice spread around them and the future uncharted and the present impossibly gentle. They did not hurry. Whatever was between them, they had both learned, at some expense, the danger of forcing things forward faster than they were ready to go. They continued the work of the investigation through August, rode out when necessary, sat together in the evenings, and let the other thing grow at its own pace, tended carefully, neither of them inclined toward recklessness. He kissed her for the first time on a Saturday evening in August, 2 days before Judge Forsyth was due to arrive in Redemption. They were standing in the garden at the back of the adobe house in the last of the evening light, he showing her the tomatoes that had come in better than expected, and she had said something that made him laugh genuinely, with his whole face, and in the aftermath of the laugh, he had looked at her with everything unguarded for once, all the careful layering set aside, and she had looked back at him the same way, and he had leaned and kissed her with the same quality he brought to all his deliberate things, unhurried, attentive. Entirely certain that he meant it, she kissed him back with the same certainty. When they separated, both of them stood in the garden in the late summer air, and the quality of the silence between them had shifted entirely. It was the silence of something settled, something acknowledged, something that had found its name. "Well," she said, because she had to say something or she was going to say too much. "Yes," he said, with the small private smile that she had been collecting for months. "Well." September arrived, and with it Judge Elias Forsyth, who proved to be a compact, brisk man in his 60s with sharp eyes and an expression of practiced impartiality that softened only slightly when he reviewed what Effie and Frederick had assembled. He spent 4 days in Redemption, taking formal depositions from Beaumont, Riker, and Clara Hinds, reviewing the documentation, meeting with the county commissioner's office, whose current occupant had no connection to Creed's arrangements and was visibly discomfited to learn what had been happening in his county, and interviewing Frederick Stone at length about the chain of evidence. On the 5th day, Judge Forsyth requested that a message be delivered to Harlan Creed, who was living in his large house outside Redemption on land that may or may not have been entirely legitimately his, informing Creed that he was required to appear before the judge and respond to formal allegations. Effie was not present for that meeting. It was conducted in the commissioner's office with legal formality, but she was told afterward by Frederick, who had attended as a material witness, that Harlan Creed had arrived confident and left shaken. Creed was not a stupid man. He knew when the ground had shifted. He had sat across from Judge Forsyth and looked at the accumulated documentation, and heard the list of witnesses and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the machinery he had relied on, the bought judges, the compliant coroners, the systems that had always tilted in his favor, had encountered something it could not simply absorb. The specific charge regarding Thomas Carver's death was the most difficult to prove directly, because the killing had been made to look like an accident, and the physical evidence was long gone. But the pattern of Creed's behavior, the systematic fraud, the documented intimidation, the timeline that placed Thomas's death precisely at the point when he had become a threat to Creed's operation, created a circumstantial case that Judge Forsyth described, in his careful legal language, as substantially compelling in conjunction with the fraud charges, which themselves constitute sufficient basis for immediate criminal inquiry. Creed was formally charged. His assets were frozen pending investigation. 2 men in his employ, facing their own charges and the sudden prospect of a judge who could not be bought, broke their silence and provided statements that moved the evidence regarding Thomas from circumstantial to something considerably more direct. One of these men had been present on the road north of San Antonio on the night Thomas Carver died. He described what he had seen. Effie sat in Mrs. Marsh's parlor and listened to Frederick tell her this, and did not weep and did not collapse. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and breathed slowly through the grief that surged and the justice that arrived simultaneously, and then she said, "Is it enough?" "It is enough," Frederick said. "Forsyth will take it before a grand jury in Austin in November. Creed will not escape this. The fraud alone will end him. The criminal charges, if the grand jury returns a true bill, will do the rest." She looked at him. "Thomas knew the truth was enough," she said. "He was right. He was just too far ahead of the moment." Frederick nodded. He reached across the small parlor table and took her hand. The days following had a quality of slow exhale. The crisis was not entirely past. There were legal processes still in motion, still requiring attention, still demanding that she remain accessible for correspondence and potential testimony. But the acute danger had passed, the machinery was running, and Effie Carver found herself in redemption. Texas in September of 1882, with the purpose that had driven her there substantially accomplished, and the question of what came next sitting in the middle of everything like an uninvited guest who had nevertheless been expected. She had not made plans beyond this. She had made a plan to get here, and a plan to build the case, and she had not allowed herself to plan past the moment of its success, because it had seemed presumptuous, and also because she had not known, until recently, that there was anything in redemption worth staying for beyond the work. Now there was. She went to the garden on a Thursday morning and found Frederick there, in the early cool, doing something careful with the herb beds. He heard her coming, he always heard her, she had noticed, with an alertness that was habit and survival, and was gradually, in her presence, becoming less defensive and more simply attentive, and looked up with that quietly glad expression that she had learned was what happiness looked like on his face before he remembered to moderate it. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She stood at the garden's edge and looked at the adobe house and the garden and the wide blue Texas sky and the limestone hills visible in the distance. "I have been thinking," she said. He said. "About what I am going to do now," she said. "About whether I am going back to San Antonio." He was very still for a moment. Then he set down the small tool he had been using and stood to his full height, brushing soil from his hands with careful attention, which she recognized as the thing he did when he was thinking, and not ready to think and doing something with his hands in the interval. "And what have you concluded?" he said. She looked at him. "I have concluded that I do not have a compelling reason to go back to San Antonio," she said. "I have some professional connections there, but nothing that cannot be managed from elsewhere. I have a small savings that is nearly depleted and will need attending to, but that is a practical problem rather than a geographic one." She paused. "I have concluded that the most interesting thing that has happened to me in my adult life, and possibly the most important, is standing in a garden in Redemption, Texas, covered in soil to the elbow, and looking at me as though he is hoping I will say what I am about to say. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at her with those gray eyes completely unguarded, and she could see everything in them. The hope and the fear and the recognition and the weight of the dark past, and the fragile, determined thing that was growing in spite of it. "What are you about to say?" he said, and his voice was careful and soft. "That I would like to stay," she said. If you would, I am not asking for more than what is right and reasonable and whatever you are able to give honestly. But I would like to stay in Redemption, and I would like it to be because of you." He crossed the garden to her, not quickly, with the deliberate care of a man who did not trust himself to rush. He stood in front of her and lifted his hand and put it against her cheek, and she leaned into it slightly, and he said, very quietly, "I would like you to stay." Mrs. Marsh was, it became apparent, delighted. She had opinions about the whole development that she expressed with the contained enthusiasm of a woman who had watched the thing building for weeks and had been waiting for someone to stop being sensible and get on with it. "He is a good man," she told Effie firmly, over breakfast the following morning. "Whatever people say about what he was, a person is what they are doing, not only what they did." "I know," Effie said. "He built the widow Hensley's fence after her husband passed last winter," Mrs. Marsh continued, with the tone of a woman presenting irrefutable evidence. "Did not charge her a cent, fixed the schoolhouse roof in the spring, helped old Mr. Perkins get his wagon out of the arroyo in July. He thinks nobody notices, but everybody notices." Effie smiled into her coffee. The question of Effie's longer-term arrangements in Redemption resolved itself with the practical logic of frontier life. She had bookkeeping skills, and Redemption had several businesses whose accounts were being managed with more hope than precision. Within 3 weeks of deciding to stay, she had an arrangement with the general store, the hotel, and the small land office, a legitimate one, recently installed as part of the county's reform efforts in the wake of Creed's exposure, to manage their accounts on a monthly basis. It was enough for a modest income. It was work she was good at and could respect. She also, with Mrs. Marsh's cheerful assistance, moved into a small but solid rented house 2 streets from the eastern edge of town. It was proper. It was the right thing. She and Frederick were building something carefully, and the building mattered. Through October, as the November date of the Austin grand jury approached, they spent long evenings together, at his table or hers, reading or talking or simply in the comfortable proximity they had discovered, which felt like something that had always been there, and was only now finding its natural form. He read to her sometimes, which she would not have predicted she would find as profoundly pleasant as she did. She read to him as well, and he listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything she said or did, which remained, even after months, the thing she treasured most about him. One evening in mid-October, sitting in his parlor with a lamp between them and the autumn air coming through the window, she said, because she had been thinking about it and it seemed important, "Tell me about her more." "About Mary," he looked up from his book. "You do not have to," she said, "but I would like to know her if you are willing. Because she mattered to you, and I want to understand you." He was quiet for a long moment, and the photograph on the shelf still faced away from the room. Then he began to speak. He told her about Mary, not the broad outline he had given at the creek, but the specific Mary, the particular person, her quick intelligence, her anger which had been righteous and earned, the letters, beginning as obligation and becoming genuine, with a warmth that had surprised them both. The specific things she had said in those letters that he still remembered precisely, because they had been so exactly right. The particular loss of her, not the dramatic loss of the Wyoming violence, but the quiet, devastating loss of fever, sudden and complete. Effie listened. She did not try to fill the silences. When he was finished, she said, "She sounds like someone who deserved more time." "Yes," he said, "she did." A pause, then, "It does not diminish what is here," he said, looking at Effie directly. "I want to be clear about that. The grief for what was and what might have been, it does not diminish what is here. I believe you know that, but I want to say it plainly. I know it, she said, and I want you to know that I am not asking you to leave any of that behind, only to let there also be this. He nodded. The photograph on the shelf, she had been patient, and she did not ask, but she noticed when the following week, he turned it so it faced the room. Mary, in the photograph, was a young woman with serious eyes. Effie looked at the photograph for a moment and felt something that was not jealousy but was something like respect, and something like gratitude for the specificity of what that past had made him into, and something like the recognition that love does not work by exclusion. In November, the grand jury in Austin returned a true bill against Harlan Creed on 17 counts, including fraud, land theft, bribery of public officials, conspiracy, and 1 count of murder in the 2nd degree relating to Thomas Carver. The last was the one that required a trial rather than a guilty plea, and the trial was set for February of 1883. Effie was notified by letter, which arrived on a cold November morning, and she read it standing in the doorway of her rented house with her breath fogging in the air. And then she sat down on her own front step in the cold and felt something enormous and quiet move through her. Frederick found her there. He had seen the letter carrier earlier and had come to check on her. He sat on the step beside her, and she handed him the letter and he read it, and then he put his arm around her and she leaned into him with everything finally released, the 6 months of iron control, the grief and the fury and the determination, and the cost of sustaining all of it. And she wept against his shoulder properly, fully, for the first time since Thomas's grave. He held her with the steadiness of a man who knew how to hold things that were breaking, and was not frightened by the weight. When she had finished, when the storm had passed and she was simply tired and lighter and still leaning against him in the November cold, she said, "I told him to be careful." "I know," he said. "He told me not to worry." "I know." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "He was brave and he was loved, and now he will have justice. That is not nothing either," she breathed. "No," she said, "it is not nothing." December in Redemption was cold and spare, and had a particular beauty in the way the light fell in winter low and clear, making the limestone hills look carved and ancient. There were 30 households in Redemption who put up decorations of some kind for Christmas, and Mrs. Marsh was one of them, and she had quietly arranged for Effie and Frederick to have Christmas dinner at her table, along with Amos Webb the rancher, the minister and his wife, and Clara Hines, who had come through Redemption on her way back to her cousin's place and been swept into the gathering by the force of Mrs. Marsh's hospitality. It was a good dinner. The table was full and warm, and the conversation moved through easy topics: the upcoming season, the town's business, the particular regional theology of when exactly in Texas one could expect actual winter, and Effie sat across the table from Frederick Stone and caught his eye and felt something in her chest that was so full and so uncomplicated that she had to look away for a moment. Clara Hines, who was observant in the way of women who had survived alone, leaned toward Effie at one point and said, very quietly, "He looks at you like you are something he thought he would not get." Effie glanced at Frederick, who was deep in a conversation with the minister about fence-line disputes and their intersection with Scripture. "I look at him the same way," she said. Clara smiled. "Good," she said. "That is exactly the right way for it to be." After dinner, walking home through the cold Redemption night with stars going overhead in remarkable density, Frederick took her hand and they walked without speaking for a while, and then he said, without preliminary, "I would like to ask you to marry me, Effie. I am aware that I am not doing this in the conventional fashion with the conventional timing, and that there is a grand jury trial in February that still represents an unresolved difficulty. And I am aware that I have a complicated past that will not stop being complicated simply because I would prefer it to. But I would like you to be my wife, and I would like to ask you now rather than waiting for a more orderly moment, because I have learned that more orderly moments are not guaranteed." She stopped walking. The stars above Redemption, Texas were extraordinary. "Frederick Stone," she said. "Yes," he said. "The answer is yes," she said. "The answer has been yes for a while. I was only waiting for you to catch up to knowing it." He made a sound that was part laugh and part something else entirely, and he pulled her close, right there in the middle of the cold Redemption Street in December, and held her with both arms, and she held him back. And the night was vast and cold and full of stars, and Effie Carver felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the world was large in a way that was expansive rather than threatening. They were married in February of 1883, the same week as the trial in Austin. The trial itself Effie did not attend for the whole of it. She gave her testimony on the second day, presenting the documents with the clear, organized precision of a woman who had lived with them for months and knew every detail of their significance. And then she and Frederick returned to Redemption and waited. They waited in the adobe house, which had already become home in the way that specific houses become home, not through length of residence, but through the accumulation of specific moments that have occurred within its walls. They were married on a Saturday, at the small church in Redemption, with Mrs. Marsh and Amos Webb and the minister's wife and Solomon Riker and his family in attendance, and Clara Hinz had come back specifically for it, which moved Effie in a way she had not anticipated. The ceremony was simple. The minister spoke without excessive ornament. Frederick stood at the front of the church in the best clothes he owned, which were clean and well-fitted and entirely Frederick practical, dignified, without pretension. And when Effie walked toward him, he looked at her with everything in his face open and present, all the layers set aside, the dark past and the careful rebuilding and the long years of trying to be something better all visible in their proper proportion, behind the something more immediate and more certain. She reached him and took his hands, and the morning light came through the church's small windows and lay in bars across the floor. "I do," she said when the time came, and meant it with the wholeness of a person who had learned the hard way which things in life were worth meaning completely. "I do," he said, and his voice was steady and his eyes were on her face. The verdict from Austin arrived by telegraph 3 days after the wedding. Harlan Creed was found guilty on 14 of 17 counts, including the murder charge. He was sentenced to life in the state penitentiary at Huntsville. The land he had stolen was ordered returned or compensated, where return was impossible. The judge noted in his remarks that the strength of the case was a testament to the determination of the victims' families and the integrity of those who had assisted them. Effie read the telegram at the kitchen table of the adobe house, her table now, her kitchen, her house, and Frederick sat across from her and watched her face. "It is done," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the telegram and then at the ceiling and then at her husband. "He will have justice," she said. "Thomas, he will have justice." Frederick nodded. She folded the telegram carefully and set it on the table and said, "I need to sit with this for a moment. There is something I need to write." She wrote a letter that afternoon to Thomas's grave, which was a thing she knew could not be delivered but which required doing regardless. She told him that she had done what she promised. She told him that the truth had been enough, just as he had believed, and that it had taken longer than it should have and had cost more than it should have, and that she was sorry she could not have kept him safe. She told him she had found something unexpected in the course of finding justice for him, that she had found a person who had showed her what it looked like when someone chose, every day, to be different from what their worst self had been, and that it had given her a more complicated and more generous understanding of human beings than she might otherwise have arrived at. She told him she was well. She told him she hoped the wherever of him could receive something from the here of her. She folded the letter and put it in the small tin box where she kept his original notes, and she would keep it there always. Spring came to Redemption. The garden came back with the particular enthusiasm of plants that have been well tended over winter. The herb beds first, then the tomatoes setting their small green intentions, the beans running up the poles Frederick had built along the south fence. She had started her own editions, lavender, at the eastern end because she liked the color, and a rose bush from a cutting Mrs. Marsh had given her, which was ornamental and impractical, and which Frederick had regarded with the fond skepticism of a man who had not previously considered decorative plants and was coming around. They had a life. The word for it was that ordinary and that specific, not just survival, not just purpose, but a life, with its accumulation of days that each contained small particular things. Her bookkeeping work, which she had developed into a small, legitimate practice serving several redemption businesses and some nearby ranches. His gardening and his occasional work for Judge Forsyth's circuit, providing the kind of careful, reliable field investigation that was different from what he had been before but drew on the same skills directed toward ends he could respect. Their evenings, their mornings, which she had not expected to find so particularly good. He was a quiet man in the domestic sense as well as the public one, and she discovered that she had not known how much she had needed that, the absence of noise for its own sake, the presence of peace that was not empty. He was also, beneath the quietness, warmer than his exterior suggested. He made her coffee the way she liked it before she was fully awake. He left books he thought she would enjoy on the edge of the table. He noticed when she was tired before she acknowledged it herself. He asked about her work with genuine curiosity, and remembered the specific names and details of the situations she described weeks later when they came up again. She, in turn, had learned the texture of his particular silences, which ones were comfortable, which ones were thinking, which ones were the residue of memory. She did not intrude on the last kind, but she stayed near them, which he had told her, one evening in April, was exactly the right thing. That proximity without pressure was what he had needed and had not known he needed. In June of 1883, exactly 1 year since she had first knocked on his door, she told him she was expecting a child. He received this information with a stillness that was different from all his other stillnesses, a stillness of scale, as if the information was so large that the normal responses were temporarily unavailable and he had to let it land fully before he could speak. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her, and she felt against her hair what she was almost certain was, for the first time in all the months she had known him, the presence of tears he did not allow himself publicly. "Are you all right?" she said into his shoulder. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I am, yes." In February of 1884, in the bedroom of the adobe house with Mrs. Marsh in attendance and a doctor named Horace Fenn, who served the county from his practice in the nearest sizable town, Effie Stone delivered a son. Frederick was in the kitchen. He had been very clear that he was going to be useful, and had not been able to identify a useful function that did not involve either being in the way or being outside in the February cold. So he had occupied himself with wood and water and fire, and the making of quantities of tea that exceeded any reasonable medical requirement, and that Mrs. Marsh accepted with the magnanimous patience of a woman who understood that men needed something to do with their hands in such moments. When Dr. Fenn came to the kitchen doorway and told him he had a son and that Effie was well, Frederick Stone stood up from where he had been sitting, and the expression on his face was one that Mrs. Marsh would describe afterward, to anyone who would listen, as the most complete thing I have ever seen on a human face, and I have seen quite a few. He went in and sat beside her on the bed, and she placed the child in his arms with the careful certainty of a woman who trusted this person entirely, and he held the baby small, red-faced, expressing his opinions about the world with the full vigor of someone with strong feelings and no capacity for restraint, and looked at him with an expression Effie could not name except to call it wonder, the pure clean kind, the kind that does not contain anything but itself. "Hello," Frederick said very quietly to the baby. "I am going to try very hard to deserve you." "You already do," Effie said. He looked at her. The gray eyes were entirely unguarded. "Thank you," he said, "for coming to my door." she laughed, which was not the expected response to the gravity of the moment, but it was her response, and it was genuine, because only Frederick Stone would say that in this moment would find the exact specific thing that was true rather than the conventional thing that was merely appropriate. "You let me in," she said. "I had good instincts for once," he said. "They named the boy Thomas. Frederick did not propose this. Effie did on the second day, when the initial enormous fact of his existence had settled slightly and names had become relevant. Frederick looked at her when she said it, and then he looked at the baby, and then he said, 'Yes. That is exactly right.'" Thomas Stone grew through his first year with the particular determination of an infant who has strong opinions about what he wants, and a generally good nature about the gap between wanting and receiving. He was a contented child, curious, with Frederick's gray eyes and Effie's quick expressions, and a laugh that arrived suddenly and without warning and brought everything in the room to a pause. Redemption knew them and accepted them in the way of small communities, not without memory of what Frederick had been, but with the layered knowledge of what he was doing every day, which was the only metric that ultimately mattered to people who had to live beside each other in limited square footage. Solomon Riker's children played in their garden. Mrs. Marsh was effectively a grandmother, and nobody bothered to specify the prefix. Clara Hinds wrote letters from her reclaimed property, which she had been awarded as part of the restitution ordered in the Creed case, and the letters were sharp and warm, and full of the specific details of a life being rebuilt. In the spring of 1885, when Thomas was 14 months old and developing strong views about the garden and what was appropriate to pull up and what was not, Frederick came inside one afternoon and sat across from Effie at the kitchen table with the look of a man who has been thinking about something for a while and has finally organized his thoughts. "I have been corresponding with Judge Forsyth," he said. "I know," she said. "What is he asking?" Frederick looked at her with a slight smile. "How did you know he was asking something?" "Because you only look like that when you are trying to decide how to tell me something," she said. "And you would not have that expression if the answer was no." He shook his head slightly, the smile fuller. "He has asked if I would be willing to take on a formal appointment," he said. "As a deputy at large for his circuit, it would involve investigation work, the kind I have been doing informally for the past 2 years. Regular pay, legal standing. It is not a sheriff's role, it is investigative work at the county level." Effie looked at him across the table and thought about what this meant, not practically, because the practical logistics were manageable, but what it meant in the register that mattered. A formal appointment, legal standing. Not the gray territory, not the hired gun, not the man working the uncertain space between law and enforcement, but a role with accountability and structure and the explicit sanction of a judge he respected. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to do it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was relief. She thought the relief of a thing that had been working toward its proper form finally arriving there. "Then do it," she said. He was appointed in April of 1885. The letter from Judge Forsyth arrived on a Tuesday, and Frederick read it twice at the kitchen table, and set it down precisely on the table's edge and said, with the understatement she had come to know as his particular way of marking the things that mattered most, "Good." She took his hand across the table. He held it. Thomas, in his high chair, knocked a wooden block off the tray with great satisfaction and watched it fall with the concentrated attention of a scientist confirming a hypothesis. The years moved as years do in a life that is genuinely lived, with the specific texture of accumulated days, some significant and some ordinary, and all of them adding to the thing that was being built. Frederick's investigative work for Forsyth's circuit took him out of redemption periodically, never for very long, and when he returned there was the particular quality of reunions between people who have chosen each other and continue to choose each other, the ordinary extraordinary fact of being known and waited for. In the summer of 1886, Effie discovered she was expecting again. She told Frederick in the garden, in the late afternoon, among the lavender and the tomatoes and the rose bush that had been thoroughly persuaded by this point to flourish. He looked at her with the same large stillness as the first time, and then the smile that came after it was perhaps the most unqualified thing she had ever seen on his face. This child was a girl, born in March of 1887 on a morning when the sun came in at a low angle through the eastern window of the bedroom and lay in warm bars across the floor, and she was small and dark-haired and loud about her initial impressions of the world. They named her Rose because the rose bush had finished taking hold that spring and was blooming with an extravagance that seemed to be making a point. Thomas, who was 3 and had strong feelings about the changes to the household routine, investigated his sister with the systematic thoroughness of a child who is not sure yet whether to approve but is going to gather full information before deciding. He approved, ultimately, somewhat to his own surprise. He brought her things, a smooth stone, a small wooden figure Frederick had carved, a particularly fine example of garden dirt in cupped hands, with the grave generosity of someone sharing his most valued possessions. Effie watched this from the doorway of the bedroom and thought about Thomas, her brother, with the kind of grief that is now gentle because it has been carried long enough to become familiar, and with the kind of continuity that was nothing so neat as consolation but was something real regardless. His name in this house, his justice secured, his absence always present and always specific, held in the same space as everything else that mattered. Frederick found her in the doorway and stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, looking at their son presenting a smooth stone to their daughter with ceremonial seriousness. "He is going to be very good at this," Frederick said. "He is going to be impossible," she said, "in the best possible way." "Yes," he said, "same thing." In September of 1888, the adobe house acquired a second bedroom. Frederick built most of it himself over the summer, with help from Amos Webb, who had retired from active ranching, and found that he had more opinions about construction than he had previously realized. The new bedroom was for the children, and it had a window facing the garden because Effie had said that was important, and Frederick had agreed without hesitation, because he had learned over 6 years of marriage that certain things are important for reasons you understand fully only after the fact, and that Effie's instincts about such things were reliably correct. Thomas claimed the wall closest to the window immediately and with authority. Rose, who was 18 months old and had her mother's determination and her father's precise observation, accepted this arrangement while giving every indication of not considering it permanent. They had dinner that September evening with Mrs. Marsh, who was 70 now and had slowed somewhat but whose opinions remained at full operational capacity, and Amos Webb, and the minister and his wife, and Solomon Riker and his family. The Riker children had grown considerably, and the eldest was now working at the land office, and the table was full and loud and warm. After dinner, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep in the new bedroom, Effie and Frederick sat on the back step of the adobe house in the September evening, with the stars coming out above the Texas hill country and the garden dark and fragrant around them, and he had his arm around her, and she was leaning against him with the ease of a person in exactly the right place. "We have had a good life," she said. He looked out at the hills. "We are having a good life," he said with the precision that was characteristic. "It is still in progress," she smiled. "Yes," she said, "still in progress." A pause, the stars thickened overhead. "Effie," he said, "I want to say something." "Say it." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was choosing the right words because the wrong words would not do justice to the thing. "The night you came to my door," he said, he stopped, started again. "I was living in a state of, I believe the word is penance. I was doing work and keeping things in order and trying to make amends in whatever ways available, and I had convinced myself, not entirely consciously, that the things I had forfeited through my failures were simply the correct cost of those failures, that I was owed something less than a full life. He paused. You came to my door and you were grief and fury and precision, and you looked at me without flinching and told me what you needed, and I thought, I'm going to help this woman. And then I thought, considerably more than I wanted to. I'm going to, he stopped again. You are going to have to finish the sentence eventually, she said, gently. I thought I was going to love this woman, he said, with the directness that was only possible for him when the thing was too important for any other approach. And it terrified me, because I did not think I was in a position to love anyone well. And then you stayed, and then you told me the truth at my table, and then you asked me whether I had ever loved anyone, and I had to tell you the truth because I was not going to lie to you about anything. She remembered that moment. The parlor, the evening light, the question she had not planned to ask, his steady gray eyes on her face, the single nod. You nodded, she said. I nodded, he said, because I had. And because I was, in that moment, beginning to again, and I did not know how to say that yet. I only knew that the honest answer to your question was yes, in both the past tense and the present progressive. She turned to look at him in the dark. His profile, familiar as her own hands, the straight nose, the jaw, the gray eyes looking at the stars that looked back at all of them with perfect indifference. Frederick, she said. He looked at her. I am glad you let me in, she said. I am glad you knocked, he said. She kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the stars were extraordinary above the Texas hill country, and the garden was full of the things they had grown, and inside the house their children slept the deep sleep of children who are safe, and Effie Stone, who had come to a strange town with her grief and her brother's documents, and a determination not to be defeated by the injustice of the world, felt the fullness of the life she had found here, in this house, with this man. With everything still in progress and everything, fundamentally, right. In 1890, a woman from the San Antonio newspaper made the journey to redemption to write about the Creed case, which was being revisited in legal circles as an example of successful restitution and accountability in a territory notorious for the opposite. She arrived on a Tuesday and found Effie in the general store's back office doing accounts, and Frederick in the garden, and the children, Thomas, now 6, and Rose, now 3, somewhere in the vicinity making their combined opinions about the world broadly known. The reporter, a brisk young woman named Helen Crane, who was 24 and handling her first major assignment with visible determination, sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and asked Effie about the case. And Effie told her what could be told: the documents, the witnesses, the process, the outcome. She was precise and clear and gave credit accurately, to Thomas for finding the truth, to Arthur Beaumont for finally speaking it, to Solomon Riker and Clara Hinz for their courage, to Judge Forsyth for his integrity. She mentioned Frederick's role with the same precision. Helen Crane looked up from her notebook. People speak very highly of your husband, she said. Even knowing his history. His history includes his history, Effie said. It also includes everything he has done since. People are more than the worst period of their lives. Helen Crane wrote this down. Then she looked up again. How did you know, she asked, with the directness of a journalist who was also simply a young woman curious about a thing, that he was someone you could trust, given his reputation? Effie thought about this. She thought about the parlor, the documents, the coffee, the steady gray eyes. She thought about the creek and the camp and the long rides through the hill country. She thought about the question she had asked him and the answer that had not been the convenient thing but the true one. He was honest about things that it would have been easier to be dishonest about, she said. And he was gentle with things that he did not have to be gentle with. And when I asked him something important, he told me the truth. She paused. That is how you know. Frederick came in from the garden at that point, carrying Thomas, who had apparently decided that the garden was insufficient entertainment and that his father was an appropriate vehicle for the return journey. Rose was on Frederick's heels, explaining something about a caterpillar with the urgency of scientific discovery. He stopped when he saw the reporter, and the reporter looked at him, this man who had been a gunslinger, who had worked in gray territories, who had a complicated past and a garden and a family and the measured, rebuilt quality of a person who had decided to be something specific. And Effie watched her see all of that in the space of a moment. "Mr. Stone," Helen Crane said, "I was just asking your wife how she knew she could trust you." Frederick set Thomas down and looked at Effie with a small private smile. "What did she say?" he asked. "That you told the truth when it would have been easier not to," Helen Crane said. He nodded once, deliberate, the gesture that had been his from the beginning, the gesture that meant exactly what it said and nothing it did not. "That is the only strategy I ever found that worked," he said. "Everything else falls apart eventually. The truth tends to hold." He looked at Effie when he said it, and she looked back at him. And the reporter was writing something in her notebook, and the children were investigating the kitchen. And the afternoon light was coming through the east window of the house on the edge of Redemption, Texas. And the life they were living was full and specific and entirely, completely theirs. Thomas ran through from the kitchen doorway and barreled into his father's legs with the velocity of a child who has not yet developed the concept of restraint. And Frederick caught him with the automatic ease of a man who has learned this particular kind of ambush thoroughly. And Rose appeared at Effie's side and leaned against her with the comfortable weight of a 3-year-old, who has assessed the situation and determined that her mother is the best available option. And Effie put her hand on her daughter's dark hair and felt the whole of it, the grief that had brought her here, the justice that had come from it, the love that had arrived unexpected and built itself into something permanent, the children, the house, the garden, the man across the room who was looking at her over their son's head with the expression that was happiness, his version of it, the real and unhurried and entirely specific kind. The reporter finished her notes. The afternoon lengthened. Redemption went about its business in the way of small towns that are full of people making their lives in the particular space available to them, doing the imperfect and daily work of being human, some better and some worse, most somewhere in the always negotiated middle. Later, when Helen Crane had gone and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Effie and Frederick sat at their table with the remains of supper between them and the lamp burning low, and she looked at him and thought about everything that had brought them to this table, this house, this life. The grief and the justice and the risk and the building, all of it woven together into something that held. "Are you happy?" she asked. Not anxiously, genuinely curious. The way you ask someone you know well, not because you doubt the answer, but because you want the pleasure of hearing it said. He looked at her across the table and the lamp and the years, with the gray eyes entirely open, and the dark past in its proper proportion, and the present fully inhabited. "Yes," he said, "I am happy." And the lamp burned and the stars stood over Texas and Redemption held them all. And outside the adobe house, the garden grew in the dark with the patient certainty of things that have been properly tended and properly loved. And in the morning they would all be there. All of it still in progress, all of it still exactly right.